Hi, I'm Professor Tim Madigan, and this is the St. John Fisher Our Community Forum. Our guest today is Maureen Murphy, who is the Joseph L. Dione Professor of Education at Hofstra University. She serves with John Ridge as historian of the Irish Mission at Watson House Project, which has produced a permanent exhibition, a traveling exhibition, and a website with records digitized for 45,000 immigrant women who passed through the mission. A frequent visitor to St. John Fisher College, she's the author of Compassionate Stranger, Asenath Nicholson and the Great Irish Famine. In 2015, she was given the President's Award for Service to Ireland, and in 2017, she was named Gale of the Year by the Irish Echo. And it's a pleasure to welcome you back to St. John Fisher.
You. Thanks very much.
I thought before we get into your work, it'd be just nice to know a bit about yourself and how you got interested in Irish studies.
Well, I thought I was Irish until I went to Ireland. You know, I grew up in an Irish-American neighborhood, although we had to watch out. The Barones would jump out of the trees on us. But otherwise, we just thought we were Irish. My mother is Welsh and French-Canadian, but she bought into the Irish thing, so we were very much an Irish family. My name was Maureen O'Rourke, so that always caused people to say, oh, yes, yeah. And I don't know if you remember this, Tim, you're a bit younger than I am, but when The Quiet Man came out, The Quiet Man was a terrific effect on me, terrific influence on me, the wonderful music. It was the chance for me to see Ireland for the first time, the scenery, the music, not just John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara, and of course Barry Fitzgerald, Nicolene, Ogo, Flynn, but all those wonderful Irish players playing all those bit parts. So we watched it all the time, and eventually it became something called $1 Million Movie.
Oh yes.
And it was on for a week at weird times.
Yeah.
And my parents would let me get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to watch The Quiet Man. Now, interestingly enough, when I went to Dublin in the mid-'60s to be a student, the Irish really turned their nose up at The Quiet Man. Now, of course, they've discovered it, and it's great for tourism.
Exactly.
So
I've been to the bridge.
Yes, they're quite willing to go along with Quiet Man. But at the time, they wanted to prove that they were much more with it and much more up to date. Although where I lived with my grandparents, my grandmother's family lived, they had just had the turning on of the electricity 2 years earlier. Oh, yeah. And both in that place where I did my field work and in Connemara where I learned my Irish, there was no water in the house. And De Valera had promised water in 1932, and they didn't have water in the mid-'60s. So, spoiler alert, I'm not a De Valera fan. But that's my background, and as I say, with a name like Maureen O'Rourke, I was always interested in Ireland.
Well, where did your ancestors come from in Ireland?
My grandmother was from Ballinamuck, County Longford, which was, of course, the site of the battle, the last invasion of the French invasion of Ireland in 1798. My grandfather was a Thatcher from County Leitrim, and he was Mick Rourke, the Thatcher, O-R-O-R-K-E, like your Captain Patrick O'Rourke, or Colonel Patrick O'Rourke here in Rochester.
Great Civil War
a great Civil War veteran, indeed.
Now,
yes.
When did your ancestors come to the United States?
My grandmother and grandfather came in the latter part of the 19th century.
Okay.
So that when Carolyn Callery and her gang from Strokestown were trying to collect famine memories, they said to me, would I go on camera with them and talk about my family's famine memories? I said, there aren't any. My people didn't come till the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, as far as I know, my ancestors came over in the 1870s.
Yes, yes, and that was a time of double-digit, poverty, and there were crop failures at that time too, and that's what led to the 1879 founding of the Land League by Michael Davitt in County Mayo.
Well, I know you've done a lot of work on the famine, and you spoke here, I think it was in 2015, when your book on Asenath Nicholson was published by Syracuse University Press.
That's correct.
Great press from near here. And could you tell us a bit about who she was and why she's so important?
Well, what happened was I had a scholarship to Ireland, and I had to be enrolled in a program or a course at University College Dublin. Hard to believe now, in those days, but the professor of Irish folklore, and that's what I was studying, I was interested in the relationship between oral and written history. And the professor of Irish folklore simply said he wasn't taking students.
Wow.
That was it. So I went over
It's a nice luxury.
Yeah. I went over to the English department and I saw Roger McHugh, who had been a visiting professor at Indiana, and I studied with him. So I went in to see Professor McHugh and I said, "Can I do something with you?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "But what do you want to do?" And I said, "I'm very interested in travelers' tales, in Irish, pre-famine Irish history, and particularly people who were touring in Ireland, and then the pre-famine fiction. How did they relate?" And so he leaned back in his chair. We were up at the top of the old Earlsford Terrace building at UCD. He leaned back and he said, "Miss O'Rourke, did you ever hear of Asenath Nicholson?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, Sean O'Fwellon wrote, of course, the biography, it was the sitting biography at that time of Daniel O'Connell called King of the Beggars. And he said, this woman, Asenath Nicholson, who walked through Ireland in 1844 and 1845, on the eve of the famine, left the best record of Ireland before the famine that we have." And just recently, because he was still alive, he died later that year, but McHugh said, and Frank O'Connor, in his book, The Backward Look, which was a history of Anglo-Irish literature, he also thought Nicholson was an unusually strong voice. So he said, "Why don't you take a look at her book? It's called Ireland's Welcome to the Stranger, and come back in a week and let's talk about it." So I left his office, walked down Dawson Street, you remember, and in those days, Hodges Figgis was on the other side of the street. But Hodges Figgis in those days also had bins of books out in front of the window. So I'm poking around as usual, and for 5 shillings, I found a copy of Ireland's Welcome to the Stranger and took it home to Waterloo Road, where I was living that year, and the rest is history. I spent 50 years writing that book because she left us very little about herself. So I had to, and Roy Foster was very helpful. Remember, he did the 2-volume biography of W.B. Yeats, and people said to him, "What are you going to do? I mean, everything's been written about Yeats. What are you going to write about Yeats?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to look and see what other people said about Yeats." And so I thought, I'll look and see what other people said about Asenath Nicholson, who was an abolitionist. She ran a temperance boarding house. She was a school teacher. She did her own kind of one-woman social work. She was a cause person, not an organization person. And one of her great pals with whom she exchanged letters was William Goodell, who lived down, and I'm going to mispronounce it, is it Honeoye or Honeoye?
Honeoye Falls?
Honeoye Lake?
Honeoye,
Yeah.
Okay, New York.
And he wound up there, and she wrote to him
right?
from Ireland and from England when she was there. So anyway, I started.
We'll have to investigate that.
Yeah,
more.
yes, I will do that more. And of course, I know that there's a great interest here in Rochester about Frederick Douglass, and she lived with Richard Davis Webb, the Quaker printer, who was Douglass's host. Now, Nicholson lived with them in 1845, September, the same time that the famine started, and then she left Dublin, and Frederick Douglass arrived. And Frederick Douglass stayed, and you know our friend Christine Keneally has done a lot of work on Douglass, and she has managed to collect and transcribe all of Douglass's speeches that he gave in Ireland. But part of the thing for Douglass is that he was so delighted that there were groups of ladies' tea parties, and he would be invited. And the idea that white women would invite him to be a guest in their home really delighted him. He had a little trouble with Richard Davis Webb because Douglass wanted his books published. And Richard Davis Webb was a Quaker printer, but he was also a businessman. And so he was concerned about how receptive people would be and how they would.
Yeah, Colin McCann's book was a transatlantic as a
Yes,
fictionalized
that's right.
version of their
Yeah.
unhappy relationship.
Yes, and in fact, Colin McCann said to me when I talked to him about it, he mentioned Richard Davis Webb, and I said, you know, he was much better than you let him be in Transatlantic. He said, oh, I know, I didn't think you'd like it. I said, no, I didn't like it. He was a very decent fellow. And Frederick Douglass was not the world's best house guest.
He was a headstrong
Yes,
individual.
yes, he was. So anyway, I started with Nicholson.
Just jumping back a step, so Nicholson, she was born in the United States.
Nicholson was born in the United States. She was Asenath Hatch, and she was born in Chelsea, Vermont, which was at that time on the frontier, the sort of northwest frontier. Her parents were from eastern Massachusetts. Her father was from Scituate. And her mother's people, her mother had ancestors who arrived on the Mayflower. And they met in Worcester and married. And then Mr. Hatch, Michael Hatch, went further west to develop land on the Vermont frontier. And Asenath Nicholson was born there in 1792. And she was trained, she was the youngest of a long family, kept in school probably longer than anybody else. And she was trained as a school teacher, and I found out later, reading a history of Chelsea, Vermont, that she was a memorable school teacher. People talked about what a marvelous teacher she was. She doesn't tell us, but I found out later that she went to Elizabethtown, New York. And in Elizabethtown, New York, she had a school for kids, probably a kind of a boarding school. People out in the country sent their kids in. And among her students, I think, were the children of a widower named Nicholson, Norman Nicholson. And she married him, and they began to speculate in property a bit. And the other thing that she did is she started a career in journalism. Really? And Norman Nicholson was an attorney, and his partner was a member of Congress. He was a fairly important guy. And Nicholson kind of trailed her coat a bit. She was against, for example, she was against the Masons. Not wonderful. And so I think they were possibly driven out of Elizabethtown because they show up in New York. Mm-hmm. And she starts a series of temperance boarding houses. And she was a disciple of Sylvester Graham, as in the Graham Crackers.
Graham Cracker, yeah.
And she went and heard him. And she says it was like St. John on the road to Damascus. She gave up. She was she was always a teetotaler, but she was a coffee drinker, and she gave up any kind of spirits or any kind of thing, and she gave up coffee. And then she traveled. She took a basket of apples and crackers, presumably Graham crackers, and went on the road and probably came right along here because she was on the Erie Canal.
They said Erie Canal.
Right along here on the Erie Canal, yeah. And then, as I say, she had a series of temperance boarding houses in New York, and she wanted to personally investigate the condition of the Irish poor. Her father said to his children, "The Irish are a suffering people. And when they come to you, don't send them away empty." And so she started that. And as I say, she was an issue person, not a organization person. She preferred to work by herself, but she went into the 5 Points, and she met, she said, the Irish in the garrets and cellars of New York. And so when life made it possible, I think Norman Nicholson took off. After all, he had married a school teacher. Now she's a temperance abolitionist running a boarding house. I think he said, "I'm out of here," because he took off. But she was listed as a widow in 1844, and that's when she went on the Brooklyn. It's a ship that later took the Mormons around the Horn to California. And she went to Ireland on the Brooklyn and spent the better part of a year walking around Ireland.
Now, what was her purpose for going to Ireland?
To personally investigate the condition of the Irish poor. And for those people who could read, she would give temperance copies. And for those who couldn't read, she would read the gospel to them.
Did she meet Father Matthew? When she
Oh,
was in
indeed,
Cork,
they
the
were
great temperance
great friends.
Okay.
But just think for a minute. Here is Nicholson. She wore a bonnet. She wore what she called Indian rubber boots and a polka coat, and she carried an enormous black bearskin muff from which she produced these they were really little copies of the Gospels, and she complained that people stared at her.
They probably would have rather had the crackers.
I think they probably would have. Yes, she met Father Matthew. She met Father Matthew, and they were great friends, and she dined at his house, at Father Matthew's house. And so she traveled around Ireland, and she was in a kind of power vacuum. The Catholics distrusted her because of proselytizing Protestants. And the Protestants distrusted her because of her rather democratic attitude toward the Irish poor. So,
what denomination was she?
She was, I think, she was certainly Protestant. I would call her an evangelical Protestant. And while she never identifies herself, I would say if I had to say one denomination, I'd call her a Methodist,
Yeah,
but
that's what I would think.
probably a Methodist. But she walked around, as I say, she walked around handing out her temperance, handing out her testaments and singing. She believed that singing was part of worship, and her favorite song, written by a guy born in Clinton, New York, was "Majestic sweetness sits enthroned upon the heavenly brow." That was her very favorite song that she sang. And is a charming business where she's walking through the west of Ireland and she's singing "Majestic Sweetness," and a boy playing a pipe they begin to have a kind of duet back and forth. It's full of very charming...
Like dueling banjos.
Yeah, dueling banjo, very charming details. But in Ireland's Welcome to the Stranger, she stays with the poor. I mean, she's somebody who's quite happy to have a mug of water and a potato. And so she's sitting with the poor by the fire. Yeah, well, this is before the famine. This is 1844.
So she was there before the famine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what she tells us, and when you begin to see what Nicholson begins to identify, are the conditions that led to the Great Irish Famine.
Sure.
She sees, for example, endemic poverty. She sees the condition of the houses and the fact that eviction is always something that people are concerned about. She sees that people are underemployed, though eager for work. She sees a single food source. And she begins to see that in some parts of Ireland, there is a tremendous population density, but very little agricultural output. In fact, when I taught one time in Gorey, it was right after Hurricane Katrina, and I said to the kids, I gave them a map, one of Ruth Dudley Edwards' maps, about the relationship between agricultural output and population, divide them in 4, and I said, now take a look at that, and what do you make of it? And so they said, oh, wow, yeah, those areas with a lot of people and very little agriculture, they would have trouble. And I said, yeah, this is before the famine. They knew before the famine what places would have the difficulty. And one of the kids raised his hand, Miss. I said, yes. He said, that was like Hurricane Katrina. They knew where the walls wouldn't hold. They knew where the water would come in. I said, yeah, the 9th Ward. They knew exactly what was going to happen. So what is the responsibility of people who know that kind of information? Well, they should be prepared, and so we went off on that. But Nicholson traveled all over. She was very interested in the evangelical settlements down in Dingle, and particularly in Achill Island. And in Dingle, she went to the schools, and she was a teacher. And you always get from Nicholson a sense of what's going on in the community based on what's going on in the local schools. So she says to the woman in the Dingle mission, now what do you teach the children? Oh, we teach them a little reading and a little writing. Well, do you teach them numbers? No. Do you teach them maps? No. No, these are the children of the poor. You know, we teach them what they need in their condition. And then she goes to the presentation nuns. Father Matthew is the chaplain to the presentations in Cork, so he has given her a kind of entree to the presentations around the country. And she goes to the presentation nuns, also in Dingle, and she said, what do you teach? And so the nun said, we don't know. Our children are the children of the poor, but we don't know what God has in mind for them. And so we teach them everything we can so that they will be ready for those opportunities. So of course Nicholson just loved that because she really believed in these kind of opportunities and Christian charity. So she ran in those two places, and they were her cities on the hill. They were really lacking in Christian charity. And Mr. Nangle, who was the reverend in charge of the mission at Dugort on the Achill Island, later on published, he had a periodical called the Achill Herald and Western Witness, and it goes on about the usurpation of Christ's church in in Ireland and so forth. And it talks about Asenath Nicholson, this woman who came to their colony. He thought maybe a Jesuitical spy. He says there's nothing to suggest that she is mentally incapable, but she is the emissary of a democratic republic. Don't want to touch her.
Stop you there and encourage everyone to read your book for more details on Nicholson, because I want to give you a chance to talk about what happened in America with the Irish missions to help the young girls coming over from Ireland.
Well, you just start me on this, and I'm off to the races.
This was your talk last night at Fisher on Charlotte Grace O'Brien.
Yeah, Charlotte Grace O'Brien was born in November of 1845, just about the time that the famine was starting. And her father, William Smith O'Brien, of the great O'Brien family, descendants of Brian Boru, a great Anglo-Irish family and landowning family. Her father, William Smith O'Brien, was dismayed by the famine, and by 1848 was dismayed that the British government failed to be responsive to any kind of famine relief. So he and some other young Irelanders staged a rebellion in Tipperary. It lasted probably a half hour or 10 minutes. It was a complete failure. But they were hauled into the courts in Clonmel, and they were sentenced to be hanged or drawn, and the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. So he was sent off to Tasmania.
Yeah.
And
Thomas Francis Meagher also.
And Thomas Francis Meagher, a whole bunch of them were off to Tasmania. And Charlotte Grace O'Brien didn't see her father till she was 5 or 6 years old. But he had hoped, he said to his older daughter, wrote to his older daughter, that his family would adopt a commitment to service. And the only one who really did was Charlotte Grace O'Brien. She took care of her father, she took care of her brothers, motherless children, and then she built a little house for herself down in Foynes. I mentioned last night, of course, Foynes, you know, from Irish coffee. And she began to become interested in Ireland. She shared her father's nationalist outlook. She wrote a novel based on the Fenian Rising of 1867. And then she got interested in land reform. Mm-hmm. And she got interested in emigration. She went down to visit some family, looked out the window and saw the Germanic in the harbor. And she went and inspected the Germanic, and she didn't like the way that it was configured. Men in the front, fair enough, single men in the front, but then single women were mixed in with married couples, or as she says, people who said they were married. And so she didn't like that. So it was through her efforts. Men continued to be in the front, single women in the back, married couples in the center, and that was the configuration on the Titanic, which I talked about a bit last night, but we don't have time, unfortunately, to go into it today. But Charlotte Grace did three things. That was the first thing she did. She was concerned with people coming to Queenstown, now Cove, C-O-B-H, and they would have to stay a couple of days before their ship would sail. And so she felt that the boarding house keepers kind of took advantage of these people. And so she founded...
And these were mostly people who...
these were local...
young women who were coming to the United States for work and never returned.
Yes. And so she felt that they were being taken advantage of. So she started her own O'Brien Emigrant House for 105 people down along the beachfront. And the local boarding house keepers, who were a lot of them connected with the the city government in Queenstown. They didn't like her, and they boycotted her, and she had to import all of her supplies from Cork. She was a woman of modest means. After all, she inherited money from her father, but in those days, older brothers were in charge of the money and doled it out to the sister who they would assume couldn't look after things herself. And so this was a daunting enterprise for a woman of modest means, a single woman, who was profoundly deaf. I think that's something that we don't know about her, but she was profoundly deaf.
We mentioned that last night. And
Yeah.
of course, we have a very large deaf and hearing impaired community here in
do,
Rochester.
indeed.
I think would be interested
To hear
learning
this.
more about her.
And I remember talking to her nephew when I was a student, so 100 years ago, and he said that they would spell words in her hand. When they would go to tea, they would write the words actually in her hand. So that was the second thing she did. And the third thing she did was she was concerned with what would happen to the Irish girls when they got to America. So they were properly configured, they were properly looked after before they left, properly configured on the boats going out. And so she came to America in 1882, and she first asked Cardinal John McCloskey to help her find a tenement house of Irish immigrants so she can get a sense of what it was like for them when they landed in New York. And the tenement she describes in The Immigrants of New York, it's very like the Tenement Museum that I mentioned last night for people to go to see. Lack of ventilation, lack of light, and so forth, overcrowded and things. And she eventually asked McCloskey about founding a place where the Irish girls could stay. He wasn't interested. So somebody said to her, "You want to go out to the Midwest and see Archbishop John Ireland. Bishop John Ireland, he's your man, Bishop of St. Paul, Minnesota." So off she went, and Bishop Ireland said, "Leave it with me, Miss O'Brien, I'll take care of it." So he got the Catholic colonization behind it, including Bishop Ryan of Buffalo, a very progressive Buffalo.
Buffalonians are always ahead
very,
of the curve.
very, very ahead of the pack, and he was very much a part of it. And they founded at Castle Garden, which was where the emigrants landed, from 1865 to 1890 or so. The state looked after immigration. So Castle Garden, and it's the place where you buy tickets today to take the ferry to Ellis Island. They took the roof off and they took the rest of it off. And then after that, in 1890, the federal government took it over, and it was Ellis Island. And so girls who were not collected at Ellis Island, girls in steerage, if you came first or second class, the boat went right into the pier, you got off. But if you were in steerage, if you were third class or in steerage, you went back to Ellis Island, and the girls there had to say who was to meet them. And if they were not met by 5 o'clock, they were sent to the Mission of Our Lady of the Rosary. Then they not only started an information bureau at Castle Garden and Ellis Island, but Father Reardon, and our friend Elizabeth Oster has written about this Father Reardon. He founded the Mission of Our Lady of the Rosary in 1883. It started in business in 1884, and they looked after, between 1883 and 1908, 310,000 Irish girls passed through the port of New York.
I have to stop you there, but this is hopefully a new book for you as you
so.
explore what happened to all these young women, and many of us are their descendants here.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
But thank you for coming to Fisher, and come ye back.
Okay, thanks very much.